Right now, 1,500 Russian troops are sitting idle on a narrow strip of land squeezed between the Dniester River and the Ukrainian border, with no way out, no supplies, and no legal basis to remain. They are not surrounded by tanks. There is no artillery fire, no trenches, and not a single bullet has been fired in their direction. What has put 1,500 soldiers from one of the world's largest armies in this situation is a signature. On April 8, 2026, Moldovan President Maia Sandu signed a decree withdrawing from the Commonwealth of Independent States, and within just a few hours, the entire legal framework shielding Russia's military presence in Transnistria completely collapsed. Not a single shot, not a single airstrike. Just ink on paper, and a geopolitical calculation quietly prepared over many years. This is something that needs to stop and be thought through carefully. Moldova is a country with an area equal to 170th of Russia, without a powerful army, without nuclear weapons, without a seat on the UN Security Council, yet it has just achieved what all of NATO, with its entire collective strength, has never been able to do: completely isolate a Russian military force on European territory. The question is not whether this will happen or not, it has already happened. The real question is, how did they do it? And why could it be more important than any battle currently taking place in Ukraine? The answer lies in 3 consecutive geopolitical moves carried out by Chisinau, each more precise than any missile, and each aimed directly at the vital weak point that Moscow has no way to cover. Stay with me, because what is about to happen next will change the way you look at the map of power in Europe. To understand why a signature has such power, you need to understand Transnistria is a narrow strip of land squeezed between the Dniester River and the Ukrainian border, with an area of less than 4,200 square kilometers, a population of about 350,000 people, of whom Russians make up nearly half. Legally, under international law, it does not exist. No UN member state recognizes it, not even Russia itself, the country that backed its creation. In 1992, after the Soviet Union collapsed, Transnistria declared secession from Moldova in a short armed conflict, and since then it has existed in a legally suspended state that Moscow has deliberately maintained indefinitely. But do not confuse legal ambiguity with strategic uselessness, because for the past 30 years Transnistria has not been a real state. It has been a tool. It has been a haven for some of Europe's biggest arms smuggling bosses and former KGB agents operating right in the heart of the continent, a springboard for destabilization campaigns targeting Ukraine and the Balkans, a base for shadowy intelligence operations reaching down to the Black Sea without leaving any trace that could officially be blamed on Moscow. For those 30 years, the Kremlin has used Transnistria like a dagger placed against Moldova's flank, always there, always threatening, never pulled out, but never put away either. And the force holding that dagger in place is the Russian Operational Group of Forces, abbreviated as OGRF, present here since 1992 under the official name of Peacekeeping Force. But this is what Moscow never wants you to look at too closely. The majority of those 1,500 soldiers are not regular Russian troops sent from Moscow. They are locals, people born and raised in Transnistria who have never set foot in Russia, and are simply given Russian passports slipped into their hands like a legal label so that Moscow can call them citizens who need protection whenever it needs that pretext. We will return to this detail later, because it is the key to understanding why Moscow's grand statements about protecting these people are so hollow. But for now, let's talk about the legal framework that has allowed all of this to exist, and why it has just been broken. The CIS, the Commonwealth of Independent States, is an organization established in 1991 from the ashes of the Soviet Union, a structure that Moscow has used to maintain influence over the post-Soviet republics while still letting them believe they are independent. Moldova joined the CIS in 1994, and that membership, although never clearly spelled out in any provision, provided a thin but usable legal cover for Russia's military presence in Transnistria. A web of agreements, bilateral deals, and CIS peacekeeping mechanisms intertwined in a way complex enough that no one could simply call it an illegal occupying force without being rebutted. But Moldova did not sit still and wait. Right after Russia launched its full-scale invasion of Ukraine in 2022, Chisinau began quietly withdrawing from the CIS step by step, stopping substantive participation in the organization, and by 2023 officially withdrawing its representatives from the CIS. They did not announce it, They just silently prepared for the day when that legal cover would be completely removed. On April 5, 2026, the Moldovan parliament voted to approve withdrawal from the CIS. 6 days later, on April 8, President Maia Sandu signed the decree. Moldova officially announced its withdrawal from 3 foundational agreements of the organization, and Foreign Minister Mihai Popsoi confirmed that the notification had been sent to Minsk. Technically and legally, according to CIS rules, 12 months' notice is required, meaning Moldova will officially leave the organization in April 2027. But in terms of real geopolitics, the effect changed immediately from that day, and Moscow understands that better than anyone. The reaction came immediately from many sides, but if you read each statement carefully, you will notice one common thing. They are all just words, with no action accompanying them. Dmitry Peskov, Kremlin spokesman, said only briefly, "We regret it." Sergei Shoigu, secretary of the Russian Security Council, declared that the lives and safety of Russian citizens are being threatened, hinting at the possibility of using all necessary measures, a phrase that sounds very scary until you ask, what measures, and carried out how. Maria Zakharova called this decision economic sabotage and cited Moldova's trade deficit figures as evidence. Lavrov called it a plan to sabotage the Moldovan state. 4 statements, 4 different tones, but with the same feature. None of them could say exactly what Russia would do next, because the real answer is that they cannot do anything. Now let's talk about what all of Moscow's statements are trying to hide, the actual legal mechanism that has kept 1,500 Russian troops in Transnistria for more than 30 years, and why that mechanism has just been completely broken with a single signature. Throughout those 30 years, Russia did not rely on any single agreement to justify its military presence in Transnistria. They relied on an overlapping network of multiple layers of law deliberately intertwined so that no one could untangle them neatly. The first layer is the 1992 peacekeeping agreement signed right after the secession conflict, placing the OGRF in the position of an intermediary force between Moldova and Transnistria. The second layer is the 1994 CIS agreements, creating a multilateral framework that Russia could invoke whenever questioned. The third layer is the argument of protecting Russian citizens, the doctrine that Moscow has used not only in Transnistria, but also in Georgia, in Crimea, in Donbass, that their military presence is necessary to protect holders of Russian passports from threats. These 3 layers stacked on top of each other created what diplomats call deliberate ambiguity. No one could definitively call the Russian forces in Transnistria an illegal occupying force without being rebutted, because Russia always had at least one of those 3 arguments to invoke. And that is precisely why Moldova could not unilaterally expel them before, not because of a lack of Chisinau had lived in that trap for 30 years, fully aware of what force was sitting on its territory, fully aware of its real purpose, but without the legal tools to act. Then April 8, 2026 arrived, and all 3 of those legal layers collapsed at the same time. When Moldova withdrew from the CIS, the multilateral framework disappeared. When the multilateral framework disappeared, the 1992 peacekeeping agreement lost the legal context surrounding it. And when both of those layers were gone, the argument of protecting Russian citizens became the only reason Russia had left, but that reason alone is not enough to justify a military presence on the territory of a sovereign state under any widely recognized international legal framework. What does that mean in practice? It means that the 1,500 Russian troops in Transnistria, after just one night, shifted from the status of a peacekeeping force to the status of an illegal occupying force under international law, and this time there is no longer any room for debate. Chisinau did not stop there. The Speaker of the Moldovan Parliament confirmed that the government has declared 4 to 5 of the highest-ranking generals of the OGRF persona non grata across the entire territory controlled by Moldova. That means these officers cannot set foot in Moldova, cannot be replaced by new personnel from Russia, and more importantly, the chain of command from Moscow down to the units stationed in Transnistria has been completely severed officially. Moldovan border guards have deployed tight controls at all checkpoints. Any Russian officer trying to enter is immediately expelled. No need for a declaration of war, no need for an international court. Just a consistently enforced administrative mechanism, and the command structure of the Russian force in Transnistria is completely paralyzed. Now stop and think about this from a strategic perspective, because this is the part that most news commentary has completely overlooked. Moldova has not only stripped the Russian force of its legal status, they have placed Moscow in a perfect dilemma with no escape in any direction. Let's examine each direction. If Russia responds with force, if they try to open a military corridor, deploy new forces, or carry out any military action to protect the OGRF, they will turn themselves into an open aggressor against a sovereign state in the process of joining the European Union, at the exact moment they are under the harshest sanctions in history because of Ukraine, at the exact moment their army is being depleted day by day on the Eastern Front. Russia once compared the situation in Moldova to Donbass in 2014 as an implicit warning, but that warning only has meaning if the one issuing it still has the capacity to act, and that is no longer true. If Russia does not respond, if they swallow this decision without doing anything, they publicly admit that all of Shoigu's threats, all the statements about protecting Russian citizens, all the hints about necessary measures are empty performances. They admit that they cannot protect 1,500 people they call their own citizens who are being isolated right next to the European border. There is no third path. And this is what makes Moldova's move truly worth studying closely, because they did not need a larger army to create this dilemma. They did not need more sophisticated weapons, did not need direct military allies, did not need to do anything beyond signing the right documents at the right time with the right preparation behind it. That is what Kyrylo Budanov, head of Ukrainian intelligence, confirmed bluntly when he publicly stated that Russian forces in Transnistria are very weak and reinforcing them is physically impossible. Remember that this is not a statement from the Moldovan side. This is an assessment from the intelligence agency, but stripping the legal status is only the first move. The second move is what turns the 1,500 Russian troops from a force isolated legally into a force isolated completely physically. And to understand why that matters so much, you need to look at the geographic map of Transnistria once and really think about what you are seeing. Transnistria does not border the sea. It does not border Russia. It does not border Belarus. It is a narrow strip of land completely squeezed between Moldova to the west and Ukraine to the east. Two countries that both have no reason to allow Russia to use their territory or airspace to supply the forces stationed there. The land route through Moldova, closed, borders tightly controlled. The air route through Moldovan and Ukrainian airspace, closed. Both countries do not grant flight permissions. There are no other routes left. In pure geographic terms, Transnistria is a completely surrounded enclave, and the consequence of that is absolute. Not a single bullet, not a liter of fuel, not a single replacement soldier can be brought in by any legal means. But here is the detail that makes this situation truly tragicomic. The soldiers trapped inside cannot even sneak onto commercial flights to leave, because there are no commercial flights connecting Transnistria to Russian territory without passing through the airspace of Moldova or Ukraine. They cannot enter, they cannot exit. They are locked tightly inside a territory that is not recognized, with no legal status, no supply lines, and no way for Moscow to fulfill its promise to protect them by any means other than words. And this is the moment to recall what was mentioned earlier about the real identity of those trapped people. The majority of these 1,500 soldiers are not regular Russian troops sent from Moscow. They are locals, born and raised in Transnistria, people who have never set foot in Russia and were simply given Russian passports slipped into their hands to serve the Kremlin's citizen protection doctrine. When Shoigu declares he will protect these Russian citizens by all necessary measures, he is talking about people for whom, for many of them, Russia is only a piece of paper, not a homeland, not an identity, not a place they can return to, and Moscow knows this well. They are abandoning the very people they claim to protect, not because of a lack of will, but because of a complete lack of ability to act. The Tiraspol authorities right now look no different from an entity that has pulled the plug but still does not realize it has been disconnected, still sitting waiting for aid from Moscow, still hoping that the Kremlin will find a way, while in reality there is no way to find. But the logistical trap is only half of the second move. The other half is what lies right under the feet of those 1,500 soldiers, and it may be the most dangerous problem in Europe that most people have never heard of. Its name is Kobazna. The Kobazna ammunition depot is a direct remnant of the Soviet 14th Army when it withdrew from East Germany and Czechoslovakia at the end of the Cold War, a weapons stockpile once accumulated to serve the Warsaw Pact's plans to invade Western Europe, now left behind in dark warehouses in the middle of an unrecognized territory. Its scale is 20,000 tons of ammunition, hundreds of thousands of artillery shells, tens of thousands of tank shells, millions of small arms rounds stacked on top of each other in deteriorating structures. And here is the number that really worries weapons experts: 57% of that ammunition has expired. Not a metaphor, not an estimate. This is technical data from reports by inspectors of the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, who have repeatedly tried to access the depot for inspection and were stopped by Russian forces right at gunpoint, literally. When expired ammunition is not stored properly, it does not. And when you have 20,000 tons of unpredictable material crammed into a confined space, you have a time bomb whose clock no one knows exactly where it is pointing. If Kobazna explodes due to accident, fire, or any cause, the destructive power would be equivalent to a small nuclear weapon. An area with a radius of dozens of kilometers around it would be wiped out in seconds, and the ecological disaster would spread across the entire region, disregarding borders. For decades, Russia has used Kobazna as a double tool, both as a justification for the OGRF's military presence, with the argument that someone needs to be there to guard the ammunition depot, and as an unspoken but always clearly understood implicit threat. If you force us to leave, who will be responsible for what might happen with those 20,000 tons of ammunition? It was a perfect lever, until Moldova withdrew from the CIS, because now, Russia no longer has the legal status to keep troops at Kobazna under the guise of protection. And they are facing a problem with no good answer. They cannot relocate 20,000 tons of expired ammunition through hostile territory without causing catastrophic risk and without being detected internationally. They cannot continue to block international inspectors from entering for inspection without being rightfully condemned. And they cannot let that ammunition depot degrade on its own without bearing responsibility for the consequences. Meanwhile, Chisinau holds an extremely powerful diplomatic lever. They can invite OSCE inspectors, the European Union, and the international community to inspect at any time, forcing the world's attention onto Transnistria, forcing Russia to account for what they have hidden at gunpoint for decades, and forcing the international community to engage directly in the region in a way that Moscow cannot control. Russia has used Kobazna to anchor Moldova in immobility for 30 years. Now Kobazna itself is anchoring Russia in return, and there is no way to untangle it. And while all of that is happening at the strategic and diplomatic level, at the economic level, Transnistria is collapsing by the numbers. Ukrainian intelligence published data in April 2026 showing that Transnistria's exports have dropped by nearly 60%, real GDP has contracted by nearly 18%, and industrial production has fallen by 27.3%, all starting from January 1, 2025, when Russian gas stopped flowing through Ukraine. The region's 2026 budget recorded a deficit exceeding 41%, a figure that, to visualize, is equivalent to Ukraine's deficit while in full-scale war. The Kushiergan power plant, once the economic pride of Tiraspol for exporting electricity to Moldova to earn foreign currency, is now running on imported coal and operating on a day-to-day basis. Right in the first wave of January 2025, 75,000 households had their gas cut off. In a European winter, that is not just an inconvenience, but a real humanitarian crisis. Young and educated people are leaving en masse, finding their way to Moldova and the EU, leaving behind an aging population and an administrative apparatus that is disintegrating day by day. Transnistria does not need anyone to destroy it. It is destroying itself, and there is no rescue route from Moscow that can reach it. And the actual progress is showing that this is not just empty political rhetoric. Official EU accession negotiations opened on June 25, 2024, and by March 17, 2026, all negotiation chapters were opened informally to bypass Hungary's veto, a technical move but with clear meaning. Brussels really wants to bring Moldova in, enough to find ways around internal political obstacles. In the corridors of Brussels, Moldova is no longer called a buffer zone, it is called an indispensable strategic fortress of the European family, and Moldova has set a target to join the EU around 2028 to 2030. This is an ambitious target, but not without real basis. What reinforces that process is not only political will, but also money, and not the usual kind. The EU has committed a €1.9 billion growth package for Moldova, including modernizing the army, building cybersecurity infrastructure, and strengthening overall institutional resilience. In March 2026, the European Commission pumped in an additional loan equivalent to about $200 million. This is not humanitarian aid. This is targeted investment in Moldova's self-defense and governance capacity, designed to ensure that even if Russia finds some new lever, Moldova already has enough institutional and financial foundation to stand firm. Russia's influence is being erased from one sector after another, not through confrontation, but through systematic replacement. And then comes the Romania axis, the deepest geopolitical dimension of this entire process, and the one that is truly keeping Moscow awake in a completely literal sense. New road routes, bridges across the Prut River, energy and military infrastructure between Romania and Moldova are being integrated continuously day by day, not as a future plan, but as a reality happening right now. On April 28 and 29, 2026, in interviews with Le Monde and the podcast The Rest is Politics, President Sandu spoke bluntly that unification with Romania would allow Moldova to join the EU faster and could be beneficial, while emphasizing that the final decision must be made by the majority of citizens. The reaction from Bucharest came immediately. Romanian President Nicolae Dan reaffirmed the position on April 29 that if there is a majority supporting this project, Romania is ready, maintaining the political framework that the Romanian parliament had unanimously voted to establish since 2018, supporting unification if Moldova chooses that path through democratic means. The September 2025 poll showed 33.4% of Moldovans support unification, 45.7% oppose, not yet a majority, but the trend is changing, and more importantly, that question is being raised at the level of state leadership, not just in academic or civil circles. When Lavrov called all of this a plan to sabotage the Moldovan state, he was reacting like someone watching every lever he once had disappearing one by one, with no way left to hold on to them. That is the reaction of panic, not strategic analysis. And unlike any previous crisis Moldova has gone through, this time there are all three things at once. Institutional backing from the EU, financial backing large enough to sustain the direction, and geopolitical backing from a Romania that is increasingly becoming one of the most important NATO members on the eastern flank of Europe. Those three things combined create a vector that cannot be pulled back, and Moscow knows it. And the actual progress is showing that this is not just empty political rhetoric. Official EU accession negotiations opened on June 25, 2024, and by March 17, 2026, all negotiation chapters were opened informally to bypass Hungary's veto, a technical move but with clear meaning. Brussels really wants to bring Moldova in, enough to find ways around internal political obstacles. In the corridors of Brussels, Moldova is no longer called a buffer zone. It is called an indispensable strategic fortress of the European family, and Moldova has set a target to join the EU around 2028 to 2030. This is an ambitious target, but not without real basis. What reinforces that process is not only political will, but also money, and not the usual kind. The EU has committed a €1.9 billion growth package for Moldova, including modernizing the army, building cybersecurity infrastructure, and strengthening overall institutional resilience. In March 2026, the European Commission pumped in an additional loan equivalent to about $200 million. This is not humanitarian aid. This is targeted investment in Moldova's self-defense and governance capacity, designed to ensure that even if Russia finds some new lever, Moldova already has enough institutional and financial foundation to stand firm. Russia's influence is being erased from one sector after another, not through confrontation but through systematic replacement. And then comes the Romania axis, the deepest geopolitical dimension of this entire process, and the one that is truly keeping Moscow awake in a completely literal sense. New road routes, bridges across the Prut River, Energy and military infrastructure between Romania and Moldova are being integrated continuously day by day, not as a future plan, but as a reality happening right now. On April 28 and 29, 2026, in interviews with Le Monde and the podcast The Rest is Politics, President Sandu spoke bluntly that unification with Romania would allow Moldova to join the EU faster and could be beneficial, while emphasizing that the final decision must be made by the majority of citizens. The reaction from Bucharest came immediately. Romanian President Nicolae Dan reaffirmed the position on April 29 that if there is a majority supporting this project, Romania is ready, maintaining the political framework that the Romanian parliament had unanimously voted to establish since 2018, supporting unification if Moldova chooses that path through democratic means. The September 2025 poll showed 33.4% of Moldovans support unification, 45.7% oppose. Not yet a majority, but the trend is changing, and more importantly, that question is being raised at the level of state leadership, not just in academic or civil circles. When Lavrov called all of this a plan to sabotage the Moldovan state, he was reacting like someone watching every lever he once had disappear. But what is happening in Moldova is not just the story of a small country breaking out of the orbit of a large one. It is a sign that the entire geopolitical architecture Russia has built and maintained for more than 30 years is starting to break apart from within in ways that Moscow has no tools to stop. To understand why, you need to understand the concept that geopolitical analysts call frozen conflict, and why that has been the most effective power tool Russia has invented since the Soviet Union collapsed. The idea is very simple and very ruthless. Create or back a secessionist conflict in a country within its sphere of influence so that the conflict is never fully resolved, and use its continuous existence as an anchor, anchoring that country in a state of legal instability, preventing it from joining NATO or the EU, because those alliances do not want to admit a territory with an armed dispute, and keeping Moscow with leverage to intervene whenever necessary. Russia has deployed this model in 4 places: Transnistria in Moldova, South Ossetia and Abkhazia in Georgia, Nagorno-Karabakh in Azerbaijan, and Donbass in Ukraine. And now, looking back at all 4, you will see a picture that no one would have dared predict 30 years ago. All 4 of those frozen conflicts are failing, each in a different way, but in the same direction. Azerbaijan used military force to retake Nagorno-Karabakh in 2023, a lightning move that Russia could not or did not want to stop. Ukraine is fighting a full-scale war of attrition, and even if the final outcome is not yet decided, it is clear that the frozen conflict model in Donbass has not kept Ukraine in Moscow's orbit, but instead pushed Kiev toward the west faster than anything else. Armenia left the CSTO, the military alliance led by Russia, in 2024, a step that a few years earlier would have been considered almost politically impossible. And Moldova is using law and institutions to pull the ground out from under Russian forces without firing a single shot. 4 different methods, 4 different contexts, but the same result. The frozen conflict model is gradually losing its effectiveness as a power tool, and Moldova is writing a completely new playbook for the remaining countries seeking to escape similar traps, especially Georgia, where the South Ossetia and Abkhazia model is still being maintained, but is facing growing pressure from civil society and the pro-EU movement. But the impact of what Moldova is doing does not stop at inspiring other countries. It is directly reshaping the strategic map of Europe in ways that carry real military weight. Consider the scenario that NATO analysts are calculating. If Moldova joins the EU and the unification scenario with Romania becomes reality, NATO will have a continuous border stretching from the Baltic Sea in the north all the way down to the Black Sea in the south, a strategic wall surrounding Russia's entire western flank in Europe that Moscow has no way to break with conventional geopolitical tools. In that scenario, the 1,500 Russian troops sitting in Transnistria, the ones we have been talking about from the beginning, will wake up one day and realize they are no longer in an ambiguous buffer zone. They are in the middle of NATO territory, facing not the small army of Moldova, but the collective strength of the North Atlantic Alliance, with all of its collective defense provisions. And even before that scenario becomes reality, Ukraine is benefiting directly and concretely from what is happening in Transnistria right now. Kyiv currently has to maintain thousands of special forces troops on the southwestern border to guard against any action from the Transnistria side, and when that threat disappears completely, all of those forces can be shifted to the Eastern Front, where every soldier and every unit carries real weight in every battle. That is the indirect strategic impact of what Moldova is doing on the war in Ukraine, and it does not require a single bullet, does not require any additional defense budget, does not require anything beyond Chisinau continuing in the direction it is going. And Russia no longer has any real tools to stop that from happening. This is the most important thing to realize when reading Moscow's statements in recent weeks. Militarily, Budanov has confirmed, there is no access route, reinforcement is physically impossible. Diplomatically, Moldova has neutralized the gas lever and has the EU behind it, with 1.9 billion euros and an accession process being accelerated by every technical means possible. Economically, Transnistria is collapsing on its own with a 41% budget deficit, 60% drop in exports, and a population fleeing without Moldova having to do anything more. When Shoigu threatens, when Lavrov condemns, when Zakharova cites trade figures, when Peskov says we regret it, all of those statements share one feature that anyone following closely can recognize. It is the language of someone who has run out of cards, not the warning of someone who still has real power to act. Russia knows this, and the rest of the world is gradually realizing it. Now, let's look back at what has just happened, because when you put all three moves side by side, the overall picture becomes clear. The first move, a signature on April 8, 2026, that wiped out the entire legal status of the 1,500 Russian troops in Transnistria, turning the peacekeeping force into an illegal occupying force overnight, declaring 4 to 5 high-ranking generals persona non grata, and severing the chain of command from Moscow down without any military confrontation. The second move, the perfect logistical trap combined with Kabazna, turning the very anchoring weapon Russia had used to keep Moldova immobile for 30 years into an unresolvable burden that cannot be moved, cannot be hidden, and cannot be protected, which Russia must bear alone, while Transnistria's economy collapses by the numbers. The third move, irreversible integration, neutralizing the gas lever in advance by integrating into the European electricity grid from 2022, isolating Transnistria economically by letting the market do its job, and only then withdrawing from the CIS when all defensive layers had been built. 3 moves, 3 different targets, 1 consistent logic. Never confront directly at the point where the opponent is strongest, but attack at the exact point where the opponent has no way to respond. Moldova did not use guns. Moldova used law, institutions, timing, and calculated preparation quietly carried out over many years before taking any step visible from the outside. And the result is that the frozen conflict model, the most effective geopolitical tool Russia has deployed in Europe for more than 30 years, is being dismantled from within by a method that Moscow has not built any way to counter, because there is no military doctrine, no energy lever, no diplomatic pressure from Russia designed to counter a country that simply uses international law correctly at the right time. The real question now is no longer whether Moldova will succeed or not. Every sign is pointing in the same direction. The real question is, what lessons is Georgia drawing from what Chisinau has just done? What are the countries still trapped in Russia's other frozen conflicts calculating from the playbook that Moldova has just written? And if the answer is that they are learning, then the map of power in Europe as we know it could look very different in the next 10 years. If you want to continue following analyses like this, the real geopolitical shifts behind the news headlines, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. There is still a lot changing, and we will continue to follow it step by step.